5 minutes. I will try. Okay.
Okay.
Go, Sheikh.
Okay, thank you. Bonjour, good morning to everybody in Canada and overseas. I'm Sheikh Tijan Bangura, Chair of the Africa Study Group of the Canadian International Council in Ottawa. It is a real pleasure to welcome you again to our webinar on the theme governance and electoral processes in Africa, the 2022 elections in Kenya, gouvernance et processus électoraux en Afrique, les élections kenyanes de 2022. I would like to acknowledge that the Africa Study Group of the Canadian International Council is hosting this meeting from Ottawa on the traditional unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. Je tiens à souligner que nous tenons cette session à partir d'Ottawa, territoire traditionnel non cédé du peuple Anishinaabe Algonquin. This session, I should also mention, is being held at a historic moment in Canada-Africa relationships, as we are witnessing the first high-level working dialogue between the African Union and Canada in Ottawa. The AU mission is led by the chairperson of the AU Commission, Mr. Moussa Faki Mahamad. This webinar will be led by myself, and we will have two colleagues today, two members of the panel, and I will try first to focus on here. Our speaker will first shed their insights on the various aspects of the Kenyan election and prospect lessons to be learned. They will then explore the prospect for the upcoming elections in Africa in 2023, notably in Nigeria in February, next February, Sierra Leone, Liberia, and the DRC. We believe that free, fair, and inclusive elections are the cornerstone of democracy and inclusive governance. However, the holding of an election is not in and of itself sufficient to establish its credibility or even the state of democracy in a country. Rather, to be credible, elections must be part of a broader political framework based on good governance, the rule of law, and equal participation in political life. Despite many challenges, I would say, Africa has made tremendous progress in recent decades, both normatively and institutionally, and on the ground. Kenya general elections were held in August 9th, 2022, and we had 4 candidates for the presidency, and voters also cast ballots for governors, senators, members of parliament, and members of county assemblies. The election turned out to be a momentous political event that will have wider repercussions, especially for the East African region. Our 2 speakers are Dr. Christopher Fumuyo, who is currently the Senior Associate and Regional Director for Central and West Africa at the National Democratic Institute in Washington. He has organized and advised international elections observation missions and also supervised democracy support programs in a number of African countries. An expert on democratization in Africa, Chris is a frequent contributor to a major radio and television networks. He has published a number of articles in academic journals on African politics and democratization. He holds a law degree from the University of Yaoundé in Cameroon, an LMM in international law from Howard Law School, and a PhD in political sciences from Boston University. Chris is an adjunct professor at the African Center for Strategic Studies and a former adjunct professor of African politics and government at Georgetown University. He is bilingual in English and French. Alors, notre deuxième panéliste, c'est Madame Renée Gamao, qui va bientôt nous joindre. Nous savons qu'elle avait quelques petites difficultés techniques. Elle nous joint de Nairobi, au Kenya. Madame Renée Gamao siège actuellement au Conseil d'administration mondial d'Amnesty International, après avoir précédemment été présidente du Conseil d'administration d'Amnesty International Kenya. Elle est avocate de carrière à la Haute Cour du Kenya et exerce actuellement au Kenya. Madame Gamao est un leader communautaire de premier plan au Kenya et une militante des droits de l'homme. Elle est coach et leadership et en affaires et s'attache à aider les femmes à créer, développer et faire évoluer leurs entreprises. Elle est titulaire d'une maîtrise en droit de l'Université de Londres et a exercé au Kenya et au Royaume-Uni pendant de longues années. Renée est également une personnalité médiatique et a été l'animatrice de Capital in the Morning, une émission matinale en semaine acclamée par la critique sur la station populaire Capital du Kenya. Et il est important que je mentionne évidemment que Renée a été honorée par grâce à Marshall Trust pour son travail en faveur des femmes en Afrique, et elle est l'une des 7 championnes africaines des médias. Elle est bilingue également en anglais et en français. Je vais maintenant me tourner vers la session et j'espère que Renée nous a rejoint. Renée, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Dr. Can you hear me?
Yes. Thank you for being here. And I will pass the floor now to our moderator, also Mr. Teddy Semi, who is now online. Teddy, vous m'entendez?
Oui, je vous entends. Can everyone hear me?
Yep. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful.
Yeah.
My colleague Sheikh has already done all the hard work because he's already introduced our 2 distinguished panelists. Yeah. My name is Teddy Sami. I'm a professor and the director of the Norman Patterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University. I'd like to welcome everyone to this webinar. It's rare that I get a chance to be with distinguished lawyers. As an economist, it's great to have people with such incredible expertise on elections and the process surrounding elections and governance. I've been told that you have about 15-20 minutes each to share your insights about governance and electoral processes in Africa. Madame Renée Ngamao will share her insights about different aspects of the Kenyan elections that were recently held in August of this year, and some of the lessons that we can take from the process. And then Dr. Famunyo will discuss the elections that are going to happen in 2023, particularly in Nigeria, for example, in February, Sierra Leone in June, and then later on during the year in Liberia. So look forward to the conversation. So without further ado, I'm gonna pass the floor to you, Madame Ngamao, for your remarks. Please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Teddy, and thank you very much, Dr. Sheikh. Good evening, as it is right now in Nairobi, Kenya, on an evening where typically, as does happen on this continent, from time to time we lose electricity. But like this continent and those on this continent, versatility and creativity kicks in. And so if I do lag, just let me know, but I will be with you throughout the course of the evening. I dare not speak much in French because while I am bilingual, my language of comfort is English. So I'm going to ask, veuillez pardonnez-moi, je parle en anglais parce que c'est plus facile pour moi, mais j'entends et je comprends le français, mais je vais répondre en anglais. Bonsoir. So to give you first a little bit of a background of our East African country, there's 47.6 million of us in the Republic of Kenya, according to the last census, which was in 2019. We're about 49.5% are men, that's about 23.5 million, and 50.5 million, which is 24.01 thereabouts million, are women. And we have a third gender that is recognized in this country. And I know that this is unique to Kenya, not very many countries recognize. We have intersex persons in Kenya. And the 2019 census was the first time that intersex persons were recognized in any kind of formal way. And so registered within the census, we have 1,524 intersex persons. And so when you hear me use the word persons, male or female, I'm using this completely interchangeably in recognition of the genders and in recognition of persons, whatever persuasion. Whenever I'm invited to speak about elections, what people want to hear is a quick fix, a rapid silver bullet that's going to fix elections. From a practitioner's point of view, not just as a human rights activist, an elections observer, I beg your pardon, an elections observer, but also as someone who myself have participated in the process of elections, I can tell you this, there is no silver bullet. And so allow me to take a quick step back from the 2022 elections so that I can be able to point out to you some significant legal as well as social events that form the backdrop of what we saw in 2022. Like Canada, we too were a British colony. And until 1964, we too were under the reign of the Queen before we turned into a republic. And then starts a series of very interesting events. We start off as what is basically a federal republic. We have regions that have been delineated and very much in recognition of the different ethnic nations that we have in Kenya and the different ethnic groupings that we have in a bid to return to what was a pre-colonial system where we had a series of nations. Through a series of changes to the constitution, for various reasons which are not the subject matter of this conversation this evening. By 1969, we had found ourselves a complete republic with a very central government, having gotten rid of the regions, having taken power away, power that had been devolved by the constitution to these regions, have it brought it back and have a very, very centralized government. Of course, as you very well know, And when you see me looking to the side, all I have is my notes on the side. We have a constitution, which like the Nigerian constitution, we had a constitution, which like the Nigerian constitution, also had an age limit, a lower age limit, below which a person could not run for office, for example, for president. And I know that this is one of the things that perhaps Dr. Fomunyo will be alluding to in his conversation about Nigeria. In 1982, there's a significant event that happens to our constitution, or to our then constitution, which is that Kenya is de jure turned into a one-party state. Prior to 1982, due to a number of political machinations, it is actually a de facto one-party state. But in 1982, Parliament, in their wisdom, changed it to a one-party state. And this singular event is the backdrop against which activism is heightened within the Republic of Kenya. Prior to this, post-1963, after we had gone through the Mau Mau resistance to colonialism, we have a fairly peaceful, not very strong and not very active civil society. But this moment, 1982, marks the beginning of what will be a continuing clamor for our voices to be heard, for us to be known, for us to be part of the leadership and the political process. That goes on, and of course, reaches a crescendo, excuse me. In 1991, with the repealing of Section 2A of the Constitution. Well, we have a constitution that is in a mess. And that's what you see, that mess playing out in the 2007 post-election violence. Let me speak a little bit, very, very shortly to that, and it will become relevant shortly why this is important to the 2022 election. We still have a president at this point, even with the repeal of Section 2A. We have a president who can appoint ministers. We have a president who is a power unto itself. In fact, at this point, the presidency is above the rule of law. And so when a president from one political party has won, given the machinery that is government, it is very easy not only to suppress any other voices, but to ensure that they are completely excluded from the participatory process of parliament, and more importantly, from leadership at government decision level. In 97, having recognized that this is about to be a problem, Parliament attempts to fix this by requiring that the president appoint ministers from members of parliament across political parties. We do not have at this point a bicameral system, which is what we had at independence in 1963 and 1964. This doesn't work very well. And as you well know now, in 2007, we go into an election. It is disputed. And there not being an adequate mechanism for that dispute to be resolved, there not being an adequate level of trust that there is an institution that is independent enough to resolve this particular conflict, we see post-election violence at a level that we have never seen on this country before. Part of the agreement coming out of the post-election violence and the Kofi Annan led mediation is that we need to relook at our constitution, which is what brings us to the repeal in 2010 of the old constitution and the replacement with a new constitution. And we go back to devolved power, but now instead of 8 regions, we are at 47 counties, which are representative of the original 47 districts. So like you, we have provinces and also we have districts underneath. But now we have changed that. The provinces are removed totally and only function as administrative centers for police officers and similar institutions of security and of central government administration. We also see that now in our constitution, We have a place for women that is enshrined in the Constitution. We have 47 women representatives, not just as an affirmative action, but in recognition of the data that I pointed out and I started off with, that at the time in 2010, where 52% of Kenyans are women and their voices have not been represented. And this is an attempt to correct that. As Dr. Sheikh said, we also create within these administrative posts of governors an entire local government system, not dissimilar to what you have in Canada. And so we have leading our counties, we have a governor, and we have a local assembly, a county assembly, and members of that county assembly. But further to that, we have represented in the National Assembly a senator. And so we have 47 of those who are elected, and their role is to ensure that the laws that are being passed at the parliament level, when they are to be implemented at the county level, are actually in alignment both with the Constitution and with the laws that have recreated these new counties. And so now to the 2022 election. We go into 2022 with a number of things. A president and a vice president who, a deputy president, who had been subjected to The Hague and the process that had been as a result of the post-election violence, an accusation of crimes against humanity. And therefore, already within the country, there are two sentiments that come into 2022. Number one, we know that we can go back where we came from. Number two, we know that we need to do everything that we can to ensure that we don't. It's trite saying, I don't need to say this to you, that both of them had gone through that process and had come out of it. Whether you agree with the process or not is a separate conversation. But in 2017, thinking that we had gotten over the horror of the 2007, 2008 post-election violence, we see that there is a possibility of a return. And so what did we do as a country? And now I'm speaking to you just from a human rights activist and a human rights campaigner point of view on some of the actions that were taken. Number one, we see a very quick coalescing of all of the interested parties, whether they are faith-based, political parties, civil society, coming together very, very early in 2021 to say, we have an election looming. What is the messaging going to be? How are we going to ensure that by the time we get to 2022, we already are controlling the narrative? You and I both know that Kenya was, unfortunately, the poster child for what social media could be used to do to destroy a country. And I use those words deliberately because between the use of social media and the messages that had been used on radio in local languages, which is very nuanced language as those of the First Nation and many who are bilingual or trilingual will know, you can say something in one language which sounds fairly innocuous, but to those who understand it, there's a message that is being passed that is a subtitle. And so the first thing is the question, how do we reposition the narrative away from ethnicity and onto issues? And as you will see, in this election, we moved very, very much away from ethnicity as being the reason why blocked voting or voters would vote in block and move towards the issue. We see the beginning of the conversation about, quote unquote, the hustler economy, a bottom up. What would it look like to help those who are at the bottom of the pyramid and who is promising what? If you actually look at the two manifestos, they're not very different. But it is this idea of the freshness of a hustler economy. The hustler economy brings in a second thing, which is that there is an underdog at play. And if you looked politically, there was a lot of machination around who became the underdog, who was the underdog before, and how did that pan out? But back to what it is that these groups are doing. Pre-election, a number of things. A number of messages are agreed upon, and they're agreed upon and how they will be disseminated to various people in various ethnicities, in various languages through various media and the actors, CSOs, faith-based organizations, and to a lesser degree, the political parties. But the actors agree that they will maintain a certain number of messages. And so you will see a number of hashtags that are showing up on Twitter, which Kenyans or Kenyan youth are more comfortable with. Different ones on Facebook, which speak to a larger and older generation of voters, and also in local languages. We have an institution called the National Cohesion and Integration Commission. And this commission comes up with a lexicon of words and of phrases, even in local language and in Kiswahili, which are trigger words, that if we hear these words, that these persons who have used these words in public spaces are to be arrested. And we see something which is not seen very often. The police actually moving in against one senior politician who has used one of these trigger words in a political rally. We also see that there is a greater use of the churches, the mosques, even the gurdwaras, to continue to spread messages of peace. Eid al-Adha, for example, is used and positioned to ask for peace within the Muslim community. Similarly, with the Family Day for Catholics, and you can see this right across the board. We have greater awareness and training for false news and also for messages through social media, whether it's through WhatsApp and other private social media platforms, or whether it is through the public and better known ones. Our police went through a different kind of training on how to handle large groups of people, how themselves not to be perpetrators of post-election violence. And most importantly, if you're thinking about how did women gain so many seats, how to protect women while they are in the campaign. And this is something that we have not seen before. The judiciary is also prepared in advance, being given extra training on the technology that is used in elections, training on the conduct of elections, and is given a very clear and very short timeline in which to address presidential election petitions, if there are any. And so we see a judiciary that is not just legally or prepared, but is also technically very, very savvy. And then you can see that played in the turnaround of just 8 days in resolving the presidential election petition. There's an increase in the number of polling stations and a limit of 700 per station, which means that the voting is happening a lot faster. And we don't have these massive queues that start at 5 a.m. and that are going on all day and well into the evening in most, not all, of the polling stations. And so what happened during the election? Number one, for the first time, Kenyans living abroad, not in all the countries where they were living, but in many countries, could actually vote. This increases the participation of Kenyans and therefore the stake for peace. This is in addition to the fact that in Kenya, prisoners can vote, but can only vote in the presidential election. And so we're increasing who can vote. The technology in voter registration, in verification, and in transmission is shared so that the transmission and the verification are almost real time. Many who were observers would have noted that for a period, we could actually follow and do the tabulation, even as it was being, the numbers were being sent to the IEBC. And now very quickly to post-election, post-election and what happens. The continued message of peace, no matter what. The hashtags, whether they're in Kiswahili, in English, or in local language, saying, I love my country, reminding Kenyans, reminding people who have an interest in Kenya, that we vote peace, have taken over precedence over the narratives of whether the election is fair or unfair. The fact that this is our third presidential election petition, we actually had one in 2012, which is not spoken of much, but which had been decided in favor of against the president at the time and in favor of those who were coming in, which is to say former President Kenyatta and Deputy President then, Ruto. 2012, we have gone and had a presidential election petition and have had a result that people were unhappy with, and therefore there had been some contention. 2017, we have had another petition, and this time we've been told to go back to the polls. And when we go back to the polls, again, there is another round of voting, and we have the president and the deputy president that bring us to 2022. There is therefore within the country a greater trust in the independence of the judiciary, despite the composition of the judiciary, and despite the feel that perhaps they may go one way or they may go another. And therefore we see the rallying call, go to court. And this then reduces the tension. There's also a great strategy driving for youth not to go onto the street. And it is concerted and it is from many directions. Maintain the peace, vote Kenya. And therefore, when we get the results that we do, there is not necessarily agreement, but there is acceptance of that result. And what I want to do now is to pause here, and I will wait for questions and then speak a little bit perhaps to areas of improvement and areas of success. But I hope that this gives you a general picture of how we have arrived to 2022 and our very momentous and very peaceful election in Kenya. Thank you, and I yield the floor.
Thank you very much, Renee, for providing the background, the historical context for these 2022 elections. You actually painted a very optimistic picture of what happened, and I'm sure participants will have questions. I'd encourage the participants to post their questions in the Q&A box. You can ask your questions in French and English, and I will read them out. But I think what I will do now is pass the floor to the next panelist, Dr. Fomunyo, for his presentation. So in the meantime, if people have questions, feel free to post them in the box, and then I will read them out after his intervention. So over to you, Dr. Fomunyo, for your thoughts about governance and electoral processes.
Well, thank you very much, Teddy, for those welcoming words. And I also want to join my co-panelists in thanking Sheikh and the study group for the invitation. Bonjour à tous, c'est un réel plaisir d'être avec vous cet après-midi pour participer à ce webinaire sur les élections en Afrique. It's a wonderful privilege to be on the same panel as Senior Barrister René Gamou, who has lived through all of these experiences and has been deeply involved in electoral matters, not just in Kenya, but in other African countries as well. And having allowed us to use Kenya as a case study for this afternoon's conversation, I will then highlight some broad strokes that apply to other African countries, and then open this up into what we hope will be a very interactive session. Let me say off the bat that I agree totally with the way in which Dr. Sheikh captured the discussion in his introductory remarks, in saying that elections do not a democracy make. And we all say that because we've seen cases of countries that have had one good election, and then probably that turned out to be the last election. So elections do not a democracy make, but elections are an important pillar in the democratization process. And all of us on this conversation know that and acknowledge that. But I just want to say also that there is something really unique about elections, in the sense that it's during elections that you're able to test the vitality of the country's democracy and the functioning or the functionality of the other tenets of democratic practice. And so by looking at the legal framework of an election, you have a sense of how the country functions in terms of its constitution and its electoral act or election law. By looking at the way in which political parties function and organize rallies and public events, you get a sense on how the constitutional rights of citizens are respected, the rights of association, the freedom of speech. By watching the security services function, you get a sense of how proficient they are in providing security around elections or their professionalism, issues of freedom of the press, and all of those matters come to the fore just by the unique nature of what it entails staging an election. Today, when we talk about African elections, for those of us who have watched Africa for many decades and have worked on African issues or are from the continent, we would agree that Africa has made some progress. And I just would like to highlight 3 areas of progress with regards to elections on the continent. The first one is that between 1960 or 1964, if you're Kenya, but 1960, 1961, that whole era of independence, between that period and 1990, there were very few, if at all, cases of alternation of power through the ballot box. That most presidents were presidents for life until they passed away or until they were overthrown by military regimes. And so by the time we get to 1990, only 3 African presidents had relinquished power voluntarily. And that was Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, Seda Senghor in Senegal, and Amadou Ahidjo in Cameroon. But since the third wave of democratization that really began with the transitions in the early 90s and the reintroduction in many countries of multipartyism, we now have well over 40 individuals or personalities that have served in state houses as heads of state, but that have relinquished power either because they were term limited or because they competed in the elections and lost those elections and accepted the outcome. So we have seen some positive movement in that regard. Secondly, we have seen positive movement in efforts to professionalize election administration or election management practice. And that is borne fruit in the emergence of independent election commissions that now have the responsibility to conduct elections and hopefully do so in a non-partisan and neutral fashion. In many countries prior to that development, elections were usually conducted either by the Minister of Local Government or the Minister of Interior or Territorial Administration, which we know in many countries is a backbencher or a henchman, unfortunately always the man, a henchman of the incumbent regime. And by that identification, wasn't necessarily positioned to provide a level playing field for all of the contestants. Thirdly, we have also seen progress in the area of citizen engagement or civic engagement. And my co-panelists alluded to that and all the work that were done by the civil society of Kenya across the board, professional associations, human rights organizations, women's groups, voices for hitherto marginalized persons coming to the table and adding their voice, advocating for peace, credible and transparent elections. We continue to see more of that. And I would say that that heightened level of civic or citizen engagement that we now see across the board in Africa contributes tremendously to having inclusive, credible and transparent elections. Renee did allude to efforts that were made in Nigeria to bring more young people into the political process. And civil society in Nigeria actually mobilized themselves to advocate for a constitutional amendment that will reduce the age of access to political office in Nigeria. And they launched a nationwide campaign under the label Not Too Young to Run that allowed them to advocate in state houses, in the legislature at the national level, and even within the executive branch of government to make sure that that amendment could be passed and could take hold. And thanks to that effort, more younger people are now running for office in Nigeria. And I understand that for the Kenyan elections, a lot of young people and a lot of women got elected into office. And Kenya saw a very high turnout of those segments of society. It's also through that level of citizen engagement and civic engagement that we now see civil society organizations, whether it's in Kenya or even in countries as difficult as Zimbabwe, in Ghana, in Malawi, in Zambia, and even in Nigeria, citizen organizations come together to conduct what we call parallel vote tabulations, which is a process that allows citizens to aggregate election results as they're being announced in polling sites and to track the transmission of those results from the polling units to the national level in a way that allows them to be able to verify the authenticity of officially announced election results. That has a peace-making component to it. It has a confidence-building component to it because it encourages citizens to realize that their votes could actually get counted, and it enhances trust and transparency within the electoral framework. So that said, in terms of gains, let me just highlight 3 challenges that I see going forward for African elections. The first challenge is the whole question of electoral violence or election-related violence on the continent. Renee, my co-panelist, talked about what transpired in Kenya in 2007. And thankfully, Kenya has been able, through 2022 and all of the reforms that have been undertaken and the advocacy for peaceful participation, Kenya has now been able to turn the page on election violence to the country's credit. But we also know that in countries such as Zimbabwe, very often, all too often, electoral violence has marred political processes in the country. And that when we look at Ethiopia today, the war that rages between Ethiopia and the region of Tigray, that although we must acknowledge there were underlying grievances, that the trigger to the taking of arms was a dispute on whether elections could be conducted during the COVID pandemic. And because the regional government in Tigray took a different stance from the central government in Addis Ababa, that exacerbated the tensions between the central government and Tigray, that further morphed into the armed conflict that the country is currently experiencing. So when elections are properly conducted, they actually do strengthen other tenets of democratic practice. They are a benefit to the reputation of the economy of the country and provide other dividends, even in terms of creating an enabling environment for both domestic and external investors. But when the elections go badly also, they create an environment of violence and instability that can take down those host countries with them. The second challenge that I see on the continent has to do with electoral frameworks in some countries that could still benefit from a lot more efforts to render those processes transparent and meaningful. And when you look at those African countries that have not experienced any level of alternation of power through the ballot process, it is all too often because the electoral frameworks do not create an environment in which all competitors in an electoral process could have a fair shot at winning public office. The third challenge that I see for African countries with regards to election is the whole question of post-election governance. How can African countries build on electoral gains or successful elections to make sure that the governance in the post-election period really meets the expectations of the voters and really matches the platforms on which candidates and parties wish their campaigns? That explains why when you read the statistics or the data that's put out by reputable organizations such as Afrobarometer and other opinion polls, they do indicate that while an overwhelming majority of Africans adhere to democratic governance and see democracy as the right method of governance, they are also a vast majority very disappointed with the performance of their governments, because all too often we have beautiful, lofty promises that are made before elections and that are not respected in the post-election period. That also explains the disappointment that we see with the backsliding in countries such as Guinea-Conakry, Mali, Burkina Faso, countries that had had successful elections at one point in time, but that brought in power governments who then used their positions and the strong presidencies that Renee alluded to dismantle some of the tenets of democracy and including the constitutions of their country in an effort to perpetuate themselves in power. That said, I would like to end on a hopeful note to say that as we look forward to 2023, there are important elections in the horizon that require a lot of attention. We have Nigeria that's coming up in February, the highest populated country on the African continent, with the projections that in the next 25 years, Nigeria will become the third highest populated country in the world, coming after China and India. And therefore, it is incumbent on Democrats, not just in Nigeria, but everywhere around the world, to pay attention to what happens to Nigeria and how Nigeria conducts its elections. Because should the Nigerian elections go well, they would reinforce the success of the past elections in Kenya, of the last elections in Kenya, and would influence a more positive narrative about Africa and the ability of countries on the continent to conduct meaningful elections. On the other hand, should Nigerian elections go poorly or badly, and should the outcome be contested and become violent, then it would pull down some of the progress that's been made in terms of strengthening democracy in Nigeria since the transition from military rule in 1998, 1999. It would also present an imminent threat of further instability and insecurity to all of West Africa, given that Nigeria alone, by its population and by its 90 million plus electorate, is all of the other 14 West African countries combined. I would also like to point out that Sierra Leone and Liberia will be coming up with elections in 2023. And those countries are important because they're countries that have gone through decades of conflict, armed conflict in the past, and are now in the post-conflict rehabilitation phase in the last decade. should the 2023 elections go well for Sierra Leone and Liberia, which two countries also experienced an alternation of power through the ballot process, that practice and principle of democratic governance will be consolidated. And of course, if those elections don't go well, then the two countries, as we recently saw in huge demonstrations in Sierra Leone, that even left over dozens of people dead, that those countries, as fragile as they are, could easily relapse into conflict. I would also make the case that we keep our attention on the Democratic Republic of Congo, a country that's right in the heart of Africa and that shares a border with 9 other African countries, and that has a population of over 60 million inhabitants, but has, since independence, struggled with issues of violence and conflict in its politics. Not far from 2023 would be the case of Senegal, a country that has always been seen as a trailblazer and a leading country in West Africa, but that in recent years has also caught up with the very negative trend of speculation that the incumbent president may want to elongate his term of office, even though the constitution does state that no Senegalese president can serve more than 2 terms in office. This is a very broad overview of where I think Africa is headed for 2023, drawing on some of the lessons out of Kenya. And I really hope that as we go into the question and answer and interactive session, I will be able to respond to any questions that you may have and go into more detail on the specific issues that could be of interest to you. So thank you very much for your time and attention and for giving me the privilege to address your group this afternoon. Merci et je reste à l'écoute.
Merci beaucoup, Dr. Fomunyo, pour vos remarques. Maintenant, on va passer à l'étape des questions. So if people have questions, please put them in the Q&A, but maybe I'll use my privilege as chair to maybe push you a little bit on 2 questions, because you've, in a sense, commented on 2 things that I was thinking about before this session. One is what I would call the consolidation of democracy. So I think you both talked about elections and you know, you gave a pretty positive picture actually of what is going on. But I think your 2 comments about what happens afterwards is something that external observers might look at the picture in Africa today and come away with a very different conclusion. So you mentioned the coups in some of the countries. You've mentioned the fact that some of the leaders are trying to stay longer in power. And then it's also what happens post-elections, right? Where we often see governments that are democratically elected, but then do not fulfill any of their obligations. So at least they don't meet what they had promised. But once they're in power, it's pretty difficult to do anything about it until the next elections, right? And so I can give you examples of this. I come from Mauritius, which is a country that has had democratic elections since independence. And I think for the first time in many years, we have a situation where the government is heavily contested. And there is an argument that many of the institutions have been captured by the government. And so the opposition has no way of expressing its views and because it's a democratically elected government. So I guess my question is, first of all, about electoral frameworks. How do you make them transparent and meaningful? Because you mentioned this, so that's one question, right? So what are the exact steps you might take to do that? And then the second question, which is again a broad question, is what do you do when you have democratically elected governments that, in the eyes of the public and the opposition, are not doing anything that they've promised or are not meeting people's expectations? So maybe we can start with these 2, and then I'll go back to questions that people have put in the Q&A. Thank you. Do you want to go first, Dr. Fomunyo?
Okay, well, thank you. Let me take the first question on the electoral framework.
Yes.
I think there are very concrete steps that can be done to improve on electoral frameworks that rely on two potential constituencies. One is the work that is done by in-country civic activists, civil society organizations, the advocacy that they do on matters relating to elections. The fact that, as Renee said, in Kenya, they started well in advance, and they worked very hard to build a national consensus for peaceful elections. And that became the narrative that was carried by everyone. And that came about because of the work of civil society. I remember going to Ghana in 2008, right after the post-election violence in Kenya, which was very shocking for most of Africa. And people saw the images, including people who were not in Kenya themselves. And when I got to Accra, Ghana, the narrative in Ghana to a person was that we do not want to be like Kenya. And you heard that in meetings with political parties, with the Electoral Commission, with civil society organizations, with the security services. Everybody said, we did not want to be like Kenya. And this came about because of civic education, voter education being conducted by civil society organizations. We have just seen in Nigeria a lot of electoral reform that has been undertaken since 2011 that has now culminated with a new law that was new legislation that was enacted in May of 2022, the new Electoral Act, which would govern the 2023 elections, that builds on lessons learned from past elections and recommendations made by Nigerian civil society organizations. And so when you compare this new electoral framework with the past electoral framework, you can actually see, for example, provisions that allow the Election Commission to create a platform for the immediate posting of election results from polling units. That never used to happen before because the election management body said there was no law that authorized them to do that. Now there's legislation that allows them to do so. That allows electronic management of relationships between the Election Commission and political parties. And so when political parties need to fill candidacies, for example, with the Election Commission, that is done on an electronic platform that lays out the criteria and allows every political party that meets those criteria to be able to access that platform and do their filing electronically. And it's a time set on that platform by which the registration is closed. And when it gets to that deadline, the platform shuts down automatically for everybody. And so accusations that we used to hear before around Nigerian elections about candidate names were filed and then candidates were switched by parties at the last minute. Some parties were denied access to the Election Commission and other parties had access even past the deadlines. Those complaints no longer exist because the technology has been introduced into the process by legislation that allows the Election Commission to do that. And that is contributed to an improvement of the electoral framework. I would just add also that many countries have now become very savvy at using recommendations made by international election observation missions, combining them with recommendations made by citizen observers to then fuel the advocacy for electoral reform. And the more that we see this, the more we're going to have countries improving on their electoral processes in a way that can enhance citizen confidence that the elections will be well conducted and votes will be counted and what will be announced as the official results will be a true reflection of the voices of ordinary citizens. I will let my co-panelists respond to the second question you posed. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Over to you, Renee.
Thank you very much, Teddy. And I join issue with Dr. Chris. Allow me to just say first, in relation to just the first question, one thing. Democracy with dividends doesn't pay. And if it's continuously in a deficit, people will look for how best and where best they can find those dividends. Democracy is not the panacea to Africa's problems, but it is the most powerful tool for us to get there. So perhaps where we have seen what we have called, quote unquote, a failure of democracy, it is the delivery of those dividends that are expected by the citizenry that have not come through for a period so long, and a citizenry that has suffered so much that they're no longer willing to hold on to a tenet that does not put food on the table. And that is still the reality in our countries. The democracy is very, very living, and it's very impactful at the very basic levels. And now to the response to the second question. I think I can only point out some of the efforts that have been made within Kenya. If you look incidentally, ladies, gentlemen, and distinguished guests, you'll notice that in Kenya, we have tried every form of this democratic thing. We have had boxes, separate boxes with different photographs, each candidate of your choice. And then you lined up behind the candidate of your choice and you voted for that. And what would happen is, and this was reported and admitted even by the Attorney General of the time, the candidate who was winning, but perhaps was not the one that was wanted by the establishment, the cartons would be found the next day in the river, floating downstream. And then we tried the one where all of the candidates and all of the votes had to go into one box. So if you threw out a ballot box, you'd be throwing away even the incumbent or even the favorites' votes. And that seemed to work for a while until we had a one-party state. And then it was said the next thing to do is everyone line up so that democratically you can see the line of each and every single person. But as you know, lining up in and of itself has a lot of presumptions behind it. One, of independence. Two, that there will not be any coercion. Three, that there are no reprisals if you choose a candidate that either is not accepted politically or even socially. And so now we find ourselves in this new iteration, which so far seems to be the best one, where there's a heavy reliance on technology. There are a number of things which have been done. In theory first, our new constitution in Article 145 actually allows for the impeachment of the president. This is not new. Many constitutions have this. In practice, however, it is a lot more difficult than it is on the statute books. But there are a number of things that we've moved away from, even when we have created a presidency that is voted on its own and not as a result of the majority of MPs from a particular party that then create the ruling, that then bring the ruling president. It is a lot more difficult today to move boundaries, particularly to move county boundaries and to move constituency boundaries. And if you recall, this is where quote unquote gerrymandering happens. If you prefer that you have some more of your own people voting, then you move the boundaries. And to an extent, this had been tried through the Building Bridges initiative, which had, I admit, very many good suggestions in it. But one where there was a concern was that the boundaries might once again become fluid. And there was a recall by Kenyans to the past where this was more prevalent. The second is the practice of independent tallying. We haven't always seen that those who have tallied the votes, independent tallies, have been published. But the continued practice of this, I think, secures the vote. The third is a harder one to resolve, which is the expectation of a people who, at this time, post-COVID, and in a downward economic downturn, with a shilling that has slid in the time between the declaration of the date of the election in April and today by over 20%. It was $1 to 100 shillings when we started. It is now $1 is 120 shillings. And we are a country heavily reliant on both imports and exports. How does the political regime manage the expectations of a youth, particularly because we are youth heavy on this continent, manage the expectations of a youth who are jobless or underemployed within an agricultural system that perhaps does not offer them the kinds of jobs and the expectations for life that they want, and get countries which have hitherto not had strong economies back onto the path of a strong economy, and to meeting the expectations, not just of those who helped them to get into power, but of the electorate who voted them in. I think, Teddy, we would need to have a separate panel to discuss all of the ways in which this will happen.
Okay. Fair enough. I will ask the next two questions that were asked from participants, attendees, sorry, for today. One is, if I can simplify it a little bit, is about how much of history in the case of Kenya still shadows elections today. And the question actually references a book, Imperial Reckoning, The Untold Story of Britain's Gulag in Kenya, by Harvard historian Caroline Elkins. And so the question is, how much do you think that these precedents still matter today for Kenya? And then the next question is also for, on Kenya. It's about, I think, your comment that elections have moved from ethnicity to issues. And the question references the fact that if you look at President Ruto's cabinet, all of them look like very successful hustlers. That's the question. And so how can Kenya help non-millionaires run for office is the question. So both of them are for you, René.
Merci beaucoup. Je commence avec Madame Uber.
Yes.
And that is the extent of my friend at this point. You know, I can speak to you from two levels, and I will start first from the personal. Caroline Elkins' book references Manyani, which is a death camp that was run pretty much like the German concentration camps, but that was run in Kenya under the British colonial rule. And she also references the Molo concentration camp. My grandfather, my maternal grandfather, was actually incarcerated in Manyani. And he is one of less than 10% of the men who went in, who came out alive. My mother, at the age of 7, together with 3 of her sisters and her mother, my maternal grandmother, were interred in Molo concentration camp. And at the age of 7, her job and that of her younger sister, who was 5, was to go in the morning and check those detainees who had not woken up in the morning and check if they were alive or dead. And if they were dead or they were dying, to put a tag on them so that people would come with the wheelbarrows and take them out to the shallow mass graves where they would be put in. And so this is not a history that is a very long history for us. My mother, who I speak of, and her age mates are in their 70s now. This history continues to shadow us. However, what we see is a large group and swaths of populations that are not as directly affected. We now have voters who are speaking of their great-grandmother. And therefore, the aspirations of the youth of Kenya, as the youth of Africa, faces forward. Yes, recognizing that we have a history of colonization and that there is much still to be done in our minds, in our hearts, and in our systems to turn that around. But the aspiration of the Kenyan youth today is, how do I make it in life? And so this then is what moves the conversation and creates the appetite for a move of the conversation away from the historical ways in which things have been put together to what it is now, away from ethnicity and those clashes that had been brought about, largely instigated by this kind of history, to the present day and the future, which allows me now to respond to Paul. One of the ways in which we must continue to campaign, and indeed, if CSOs and those who are interested in the political and electoral system in Africa, because every country feeds off each other and we take precedent from one another, is the passing of the laws and the acts and the operationalization of the acts relating to capping, number one, and also declaring how much money is used in elections. It will shock you what it costs in order for one to be able to just get the party ticket and run. And even though there have been gains, and this is why I always point them out, because often we don't see them, that for those who we consider quote unquote marginalized or vulnerable groups, for women, those tickets have been reduced, or the ticket sizes and the costs for persons with disability, and for those living in marginalized areas. The actual campaign costs are still too high, and they're still prohibitive for those candidates who indeed are the real quote unquote hustlers and who can help us move away from this non-millionaire run. So we still have work to do. And the first is the passing and the enactment and also the operationalization of those laws. Thank you.
Thank you very much for answering these questions. I see that Sheikh has his hand raised. Sheikh, I guess you have a question. Please go ahead.
Oui, merci Teddy. Bilinguisme oblige.
Okay.
Je vais poser ma question en français et c'est plutôt à Chris. Je voudrais savoir à peu près, et c'est une question qui a souvent été posée, sur le rôle des organisations internationales sous-régionales en Afrique en matière électorale, notamment SADC et la CEDEAO. Et nous avons eu l'honneur d'avoir Monsieur Oké, qui est le chef du département de l'assistance électorale pour la CEDEAO. Nous l'avons eu l'année dernière sur ce plateau. Et ça, c'est la première question. La deuxième question, qui est liée à la première, quel serait le rôle des autres États internationaux tels le Canada, les États-Unis, en matière d'assistance à apporter à l'Afrique, par exemple, par l'envoi ou alors en accordant une certaine assistance au développement des institutions électorales en Afrique, par exemple. Ça, c'est la première question. L'autre question, c'est directement aussi à Chris par rapport au Libéria. On sait qu'il y a les élections, vous l'avez mentionné tout à l'heure, Chris, et on sait qu'il y a un certain risque de violence qui s'annonce à travers, dû au fait qu'on a ce monsieur Camara qui est devant la cour en France et qui est accusé de crimes contre l'humanité. Et il est considéré comme un alien du président Taylor, de l'ex-président Taylor. Est-ce que vous pensez que ça peut être une dimension qui puisse mener à un conflit électoral au Libéria? Voilà, merci.
Merci, Sheikh. Chris, do you want to take these questions?
Oui, merci Sheikh pour les trois questions. Et c'est des questions vraiment pertinentes auxquelles je vais essayer de répondre. D'abord, sur le rôle des organisations sous-régionales sur le continent. Effectivement, de la façon dont l'Union africaine est organisée, les organisations sous-régionales sont les premiers répondeurs en cas de crise politique ou de crise liée aux élections. C'est pour cela que des organisations comme SADC ou IGAD dans le compte de l'Afrique, en Afrique de l'Est, ou la CEDEAO en Afrique de l'Ouest ont un rôle capital à jouer. Il s'avère que pour le cas de la CEDEAO, avec le protocole additionnel que la CEDEAO a adopté en 2001. Et donc, il y a eu des manifestations tout récemment pour célébrer 20 ans de l'existence de ce protocole additionnel sur la bonne gouvernance et les élections, une certaine reconnaissance, même de la part de cette structure, du rôle important, de la nécessité d'avoir des élections inclusives et crédibles. Et jusqu'à un certain moment, je peux dire de 2001 jusqu'à 2015, la CEDEAO s'est très bien comportée et de manière cohérente sur ses prises de position par rapport à l'organisation des élections inclusives et transparentes. Donc, la CEDEAO a suivi et appuyé les différents processus de démocratisation dans beaucoup de pays de l'Afrique de l'Ouest. Malheureusement, je pense que pendant les 4 ou 5 dernières années, la structure sous-régionale a perdu un peu de son autorité parce que dans certains États où les citoyens s'attendaient à ce que la CEDEAO puisse se prononcer sur les questions de violation des droits de l'homme ou violation des droits humains ou sur les cas de la malgouvernance, cette structure ne s'était pas montrée ferme, surtout par rapport au président en exercice qui manigançait de façon à modifier leur constitution. Donc, je crois qu'à l'heure actuelle, la CEDEAO est en train de jouer un peu au rattrapage pour regagner sa crédibilité et sa réputation vis-à-vis des populations dans cette sous-région du continent. Et je crois que pour le cas de de la SADC, la structure a été aussi prise en otage par les relations qui ont existé pendant les mouvements pro-indépendantistes et la lutte contre l'apartheid en Afrique du Sud. Ce qui fait qu'il existait une certaine camaraderie, une certaine solidarité qui a empêché à la SADC de prendre des positions fermes vis-à-vis un pays comme le Zimbabwe, qui, dans la sous-région, a été parmi les pays les plus marqués sur les questions de malgouvernance ou des élections violentes. Et je crois que ce manque de prise de position de la part de SADC a décrédibilisé un peu la structure par rapport aux attentes des populations. Et cela m'amène à ajouter un peu à ce que disait ma co-panéliste par rapport aux attentes des jeunes Africains ou des générations actuelles des Africains. Effectivement, les gens pensent à l'histoire de leur pays, mais ils sont aussi beaucoup plus regardants sur l'avenir. Et en plus de l'exemple du Kenya, je pense que nous devons regarder et suivre de près ce qui se passe en Afrique du Sud. Toutes les difficultés que rencontre l'ANC, dont le parti majoritaire et le parti au pouvoir aujourd'hui, c'est justement parce que le débat, le discours, comme quoi c'est nous, l'ANC, qui avons lutté pour mettre fin à l'apartheid, ça ne résonne plus avec la jeune génération de Sud-Africains qui pensent à leur avenir et qui pensent aux services publics que l'État et le parti au pouvoir devraient mettre à leur disposition. Et c'est pour cela que nous voyons depuis un certain temps, ces dernières années, qu'avec chaque élection, l'ANC est en train de perdre les voix. C'est parce que les attentes de la nouvelle génération de Sud-Africains n'est plus braquée uniquement sur la lutte contre l'apartheid, mais plutôt sur la performance du parti au pouvoir et les services publics que l'État n'arrive pas à mettre à leur disposition. Le rôle des partenaires, le Canada, les États-Unis, d'autres partenaires de l'Afrique, c'est de continuer à appuyer les structures indépendantes chargées de l'organisation des élections et notamment la société civile qui de plus en plus joue un rôle significatif dans la gouvernance de nos différents pays, y compris en matière d'organisation des élections. Et je pense qu'une combinaison entre les partenaires, les structures chargées de l'organisation des élections et la société civile ira vraiment très loin dans le renforcement de l'organisation de bonnes élections sur le continent et je crois que nous devrons continuer à œuvrer dans ce sens. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup. Since we only have about 4 minutes left, I'm going to ask Renee if she has any sort of concluding thoughts or comments about the questions. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. And once again, it's such an honor to be with Dr. Chris, because whenever I listen to him, I learn also. And I join issue once again with him. Allow me to leave you with a story of budding success. No election is perfect, nowhere in the world. And we know when there's a mistrust of institutions anywhere in the world, I think the USA has taught us this, then people will take to what are extrajudicial activities to defend their democracy. We've seen in Kenya with this last election, women coalescing under organizations such as FIDA, the International Organization for Women's Lawyers, and making a concerted effort to go for what are called non-guaranteed positions, not just women's representative positions, but to contest for governor, to contest for senator, to contest for members of parliament. And I want to leave you with a couple of reflections that those who have been elected of the 29 members of parliament up from 23 have come from Muslim dominated societies and constituencies, have come from constituencies that are rural, constituencies where patriarchy is still a running and dominant theme, constituencies where female genital mutilation is still something that we are having to contend with, and yet they won. It suggests that the ship is turning, but it's a big ship and so it turns slowly. We've seen the 3 senators and 7 governors up from 3 governors. Again, across board, and again, reflective of all of the different facets of this country. And of course, as you know, we are a multiracial country here. And we see that reflected even within, we've seen it in past parliaments, and we continue to see it. On the question of on what international organizations can do, there is what is perhaps human, that when we start to see success, we stop to support the process that helps that success. And therefore, we allow for a decline because we have withdrawn the support. Civil society organizations are under threat and under attack on our continent, as in many places. And they are under threat and under attack, not just by state actors, but non-state actors as well, under the guise of corporations, under the guise of institutions, and through various means. And therefore, this is the time not only to strengthen their voices, but also to yield to the agenda that is most important to them, because he who wears the shoe knows where it hurts the most, as we say on this continent, and I'm quite sure on yours as well. And so to continue to support them is very important. And the next thing I think across board is to really look at how and what the criteria is for electoral bodies to promote electoral bodies that are independent and to resource them. And also to really work towards capping the cost of elections, because a government that is bankrupted by a singular day's event has a lot of work to deliver when it has 5 years and the first 2 are spent just looking for money to pay salaries. And the last one is, we really must rethink the debt burden that our continent carries for its development, vis-a-vis the riches that are removed from this continent. And I know that it is a controversial point to put in at the end, but I want to put it there because there needs to be some level of equity. We cannot be the richest resource continent on the one hand and the poorest financial continent on the other. And that this now is also a matter of human rights and human dignity, and also goes towards the stability of this continent and of our countries. The future is bright. The youth are ready. Our population is versatile and want to live in peace. I think the days of military coups are numbered because we really do aspire towards a democracy that delivers. I thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you. And I yield.
Thank you very much to both of you for your very insightful comments. I think you painted a very positive picture of what is going on the continent, Kenya in particular, but also other places. I just want to thank you on behalf of the Africa Study Group for being here. And I also want to thank everyone who attended today's session. So thank you very much. Over to you, Sheikh.
OK. Merci beaucoup, Teddy. Et j'avais juste un petit commentaire en fin de compte. Please allow me, on behalf of the Africa Study Group of the Canadian International Council, to thank our panelists for their excellent presentations, Chris and René. Et merci beaucoup, Teddy, pour la modération de cette session, qui, à mon avis, nous a permis d'avoir une meilleure encore connaissance de ce qui se passe sur le continent. Et notre rôle étant de changer les perceptions, dans le but de changer éventuellement les perspectives. Nous pensons que nous y apportons notre petit grain en vue de renforcer les relations Canada-Afrique. Please note that this session has been recorded and will be posted on our YouTube page. I would like to thank my colleagues from the Secretariat of the Africa Study Group, especially Marcia, Paul, Mafuya, and Patricia. And I would like also to thank the CIC National Capital Branch, our colleagues there, Sam, for all the efforts that went into organizing this session. I should remind that the Africa Study Group is directly affiliated with the Canadian International Council, and we strongly encourage our different colleagues and members of our audience to join the CSC National Capital Branch. This invitation is strongly extended to our members and our audience, both in Canada and outside of Canada. The next AHG Africa Study Group webinars will be on November 16, and as a dimension of COP27 starting next week on African soil in Egypt, we will talk about the climate change and security in Africa. This will be, this will be properly announced on our website in the next days. Ça sera tout pour aujourd'hui. I would like again to wish you good health, and depending on where you are, René in Nairobi, beautiful city, I would like to wish each of you a good day, good afternoon, and good night to Chris in Washington. Merci, à la prochaine. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye.